At the end of World War I, in 1920, the American public decided and elected the appropriate government that we would not sign the peace treaty, we would not join the League of Nations, we would not ratify the treaty that was designed to deter Germany from again invading France. We would in effect stop the earth and get off, and under those circumstances, the United States did not need any military. It's perhaps worth noting that in 1940, when the war in the West began, and the President checked with Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, the United States Army was 1/3 the size of Belgium's army. We didn't need an army after all. We had, in a minimal way, begun rebuilding our Navy in 1935 after doing away with a large part of it. And we'd also begun to think a little bit about an Air Force. But essentially the country was disarmed. When the Japanese in 1937 began their war against China, the American public tended to side with the Chinese, and we began to see the Japanese a little differently. In the 1920s, when there had been a terrible earthquake in Japan, Americans had collected money to help out. But now, especially in reports from American missionaries back to churches supporting them in the U.S., and pictures in the news magazines, they were hearing and seeing about all kinds of horrors. When the Germans start the war in Europe, some Americans think a little bit about helping the Allies. And when the Germans in the spring of 1940 win a series of victories, it finally occurs to Americans that we might need an army. And do, in October 40, start a draft. But it is worth noting that when it comes up for renewal in 1941, it passes in the Congress by 1 vote. October 41, the United States comes within 1 vote of dissolving its army. We are, Americans are, hearing on the radio about the war in Europe, and they're seeing newsreels, which in those days were more important because people went to the movies and saw the newsreels between the features. And the American public very slowly moves a little bit in favor of the Western Allies, and after the French are defeated, in support of Great Britain. In the summer of 1940, the United States trades a batch of old World War I destroyers for bases in British possessions. And then in the spring of 1941, the Congress passes the Lend-Lease bill, under which we will provide some aid, first to the British, and then after they are attacked by Germany, as I mentioned before, to the Russians. Now, we have to see this for a moment from the other side. Germany had crushed the French and driven the British off the continent in the spring of 1940. And then the Germans were defeated by the British in the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, so they could not invade England and force Britain out of the war. It was under those circumstances that Hitler thought the best thing to do was to get the Japanese to attack and seize British colonies and French and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. The British, when they lost Burma, India, and other possessions, might give in. The answer of the Japanese was, yes, we're going to do that, but we're going to do it in 1946. And the question is, why, of all years in the century, did they pick 1946? And the Germans very quickly realized the answer was that under American law, the so-called Tydings-McDuffie Act, the Philippines were going to become independent in 1944, and the United States would give up its bases in the Philippines in 1946. So as you look at the map, if you're going from Japan to Southeast and South Asia, you go by the Philippines, and they thought they'd do it after the United States had left the Philippines. The Germans responded to this answer from Tokyo with two parts. One was to tell them that this was a very poor time to pick, because by 1946, the two-ocean Navy bill that the American Congress passed in 1940 would have been implemented. The big Navy that the United States had would be increased by an even bigger one. And the big Navy that Japan was building, or had and was building, to cope with it, would have been outbuilt. And since Germany planned on war with the United States anyway, why we'll join you on war with the U.S. now if you go? Both the Germans and the Japanese had separately decided to deal with the American Navy by building super battleships. Germans had started there in February of 1939, but never finished any of them. The Japanese had started theirs about the same time, actually finished several. But by 1946, even that would not be enough. But the Germans, as I said, promised that if the Japanese struck now, the Germans would join them. From their point of view, whether an American warship was sunk in the Pacific or the Atlantic didn't make any difference. And Mussolini, the head of Italy, agreed that he too would join Japan in war against the United States if Japan struck towards Southeast Asia, and the Brits then losing their empire, Singapore, Malaya, India, Burma, maybe Australia and New Zealand, they'd call it quits. And that would be good for Italy as well as for Germany. It was under these circumstances that the Japanese debate whether or not to go to war with the United States. In the fall of 1940, they do align themselves in the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. And because since 1937, the Japanese have been fighting in China, they get the new Vichy government to allow them to occupy the northern part of French Indochina. And that enables them to cut off supplies to the Chinese nationalists from the railway that goes from ports in northern French Indochina to Chinese nationalists. But as they consider the possibilities, they also, in the summer of 1941, occupy southern French Indochina. And the American reaction to that is fundamentally different. Because if you look at your map, you can see this points away from the war with China and to war in Southeast Asia. Now, what you have then is an American reaction. We stop selling them oil. The British and Dutch stop selling them oil. We have to go back for a moment that in the spring of 41, the Soviets were providing the Germans with oil at a time when the United States was warning Stalin that the Germans were going to attack. And the German tanks that invade the Soviet Union in June 41 are using Russian oil. Roosevelt did not think it was smart for us to provide the Japanese with the oil for their navy and their tanks and other equipment to attack us. And that if they would get out of southern French Indochina and thus not head into the south, the Dutch East Indies with their oil, then we'd sell them all the oil they could possibly want. What takes place, therefore, through essentially all of 1941 is negotiations. Hitler keeps pushing the Japanese. The sooner you move, the easier it will be, the more likely it is that you can conquer all the territory you want. Roosevelt is devoting an enormous amount of time to negotiating with the Japanese in the hope, please, that the Japanese will wait long enough to see that the Germans are not guaranteed to win the war in Europe as they think. Now, this competition between Hitler pushing the Japanese not to wait and Roosevelt trying to stall them is won by about a week or 10 days by Hitler. If the Japanese had waited another week or two, they would have seen the German defeat at the northern end of the Eastern Front, the southern end of the Eastern Front, and before Moscow, as I mentioned in my last talk, and the British offensive driving the Italians out of Egypt in North Africa that I also mentioned. But the Japanese did not wait. Now, in the interim, the Japanese had also changed their plan for war with the United States. Once upon a time, the plan had been that if they went to war before the Americans left the Philippines, they would, in the initial phase, of course, among other things, land in the Philippines, and there would then be a big surface naval fight between the Japanese and American navies as the Americans tried to relieve their Philippines, since they were not waiting till 1946. But Admiral Yamamoto, head of the combined fleet, was arguing for a different approach. The United States had moved the bulk of its surface battle fleet to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Not because it was a nice place, but as a way, they hoped, of deterring the Japanese. And we were building up our Air Force, especially our bombers, in the Philippines with the same idea. And the British were sending some warships to Singapore. The hope was that we could stall and defer the Japanese. In the same week of October, in which the United States renews its draft by one vote, as I mentioned, in that week, the Japanese Naval Command gives way to Yamamoto, his threat to resign as commander of the combined fleet, and adopts his scheme. A scheme to some extent influenced by what he had seen the British do to the Italian Navy in November 1940 when it attacked Italian battleships in the harbor of Taranto. What they are going to do is surprise the American Navy in Hawaii, in Pearl Harbor, with a bunch of bombers and torpedo planes that will destroy them, and at the same time surprise, again by bombers and torpedoes, the American Air Force and Navy being built up in the Philippines to deter them. Now, as I am sure all of you know, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor is in fact a surprise attack. What I want to devote some time to are the strategic and tactical errors of Yamamoto's plan. Let me take up the strategic concept error first. The Japanese concept of a war with the United States involved a basic set of assumptions that Japan could, after crushing the American Navy, conquer all kinds of things in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia, in the South Pacific, and that the American people would never pay the price in blood and treasure to retake all these places so that they could give them back to colonial masters of which they disapproved, or the Philippines, which they'd already decided to leave. There would, in other words, be a battling towards a peace in which Japan would be able to keep a lot of what it had conquered, and the Americans would call it off rather than pay the price to take all the things back and then turn them over to the French, the British, the Dutch, Australian, whoever. This strategic concept was in fact destroyed by Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor attack. The idea of attacking a country on a Sunday in peacetime did not look right to Americans. It looked very nice to Adolf Hitler, who had just done that in April of that year to Yugoslavia. And from his point of view, the Japanese doing this proved what fine allies they would make. But the American people saw this entirely differently. We would not make an agreement with them as we had with Germany at the end of the First World War, with Spain at the end of the Spanish-American War, and would with Korea after the war with North Korea. The idea of this kind of a sneak attack on a Sunday, the slogan in the U.S. always was, "Remember Pearl Harbor." And the American people, contrary to the Japanese concept, adhered to this. There are a couple of illustrations that I just will mention. The longest battle in the history of the United States was the battle for the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomons from early August of 1942 till mid-February of 1943. Nobody in the United States, practically speaking, had ever heard of Guadalcanal. Americans didn't care about it. If that's where we have to fight the Japanese, that's where we'll fight them. And the fact that it had been a British colony beforehand, and after we reconquered it from the Japanese, it went back to the British. Nobody in this country, to the best of my knowledge, ever complained. And I have never heard or seen any sign of any American thinking that maybe there should be a monument there to Americans who died in the fighting there. But the idea of taking over and keeping the island never occurred to anybody. The bloodiest in terms of casualties battle of the Pacific War was in the spring of '45 on Okinawa. Again, this was a place that practically nobody in this country knew anything about or cared about. But in April, May, June, and into July of '45, Americans fought there. And the general attitude of the people in this country at the time was, if this is where we have to fight the Japanese, that's where we'll fight the Japanese. The idea of annexing Okinawa when it was all over never occurred, as far as I can tell, to anybody in this country. The picture of the Pacific War that is most widely distributed in this country and recognized is that of the raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. There was one of the other bitter battles. Again, people in this country neither knew nor cared about Iwo Jima beforehand or afterwards. And nobody, to the best of my knowledge, has ever suggested that because we fought there and raised a flag there, somehow the United States should annex Iwo Jima. It's just not one of those things. In other words, the strategic concept of the Japanese was ironically destroyed by their very first step. There were two serious tactical errors inherent in the Pearl Harbor attack. The Japanese knew that the water in Pearl Harbor was very shallow. And the last thing that the Japanese fleet did before it headed for this attack was to take on board a special variety of the Japanese torpedoes that didn't run as deep as they usually did, so that they could be used in Pearl Harbor. What this meant as a practical matter is that the battleships that were sunk in Pearl Harbor were, with two exceptions, the Arizona and the Oklahoma, all raised, repaired, and returned to service. And since the Americans were not going to negotiate a peace after this, they were back in the fighting. And it is ironic but interesting that in the one real battleship engagement of the Pacific War, in the fall of '44 off the Philippines, Surigao Strait battle, a batch of American battleships destroyed a part of the Japanese fleet. And of those battleships, all but one had been sunk in Pearl Harbor. It may have been just as well for Yamamoto that he'd been killed the year and a half before and could not see in reality that these battleships he imagined he had eliminated from the American Navy were in fact out there destroying Japanese battleships and other ships. The other tactical error inherent in the Pearl Harbor attack is one that you very practically never hear about, and people may resent it, but I think it's important. If you attack a batch of warships in harbor on a Sunday, you practically guarantee that the overwhelming majority of the trained sailors on those ships are going to survive. I do not want to minimize the very high number of casualties, especially on the Arizona. And if you ever visit the Arizona War Memorial today, you will see their names there, over 1,000. But over 90% of the American naval personnel in Honolulu survived. When warships are sunk in the ocean, it's all very different. In the same year, 1941, in May, the German battleship Bismarck, along with a cruiser, had gone out into the North Atlantic. When the British tried to stop it, battlecruiser Hood went down. Out of over 1,500 people on board, 2 were saved. Shortly after, the Bismarck German battleship was sunk by the British Navy. Of the 2,400 people aboard, 130 were saved. The reality of the Pearl Harbor attack was, of course, somewhere in excess of 2,000 Americans lost their lives, and I don't want to minimize that. But the recovery of the American Navy in the subsequent development of the Pacific War is normally discussed by people in terms of the either repaired ships or, more important, the new ships becoming available. What people forget is that these warships don't operate automatically. They need trained crews. And the decision to attack the American Navy in port on a Sunday meant that there were lots of American crew members who had their training already, who were available not only for when the allegedly sunk battleships and other warships were repaired and raised, but who could be allocated to the new American ships that were built and being made ready. There are two other aspects of this that I believe are worth noting. The surprise works not only in Pearl Harbor, but several hours later in the Philippines, because nobody wants to wake up Douglas MacArthur. And therefore, our airplanes there don't take off until the Japanese are overhead dropping bombs or machine gunning them. Perhaps, in some ways, more important is a set of events at this same time in December 1941 that provides us with important insight into the opposing leaders in a way that I don't often hear discussed. Hitler learns that the Japanese have finally, from his point of view, finally moved on the 8th of December. At the time when he learns, he is not in Berlin because of the crisis on the Eastern Front. We're talking about early December 41. He is at his military headquarters in East Prussia, trying to control the situation before Moscow. He has to go to Berlin, go through some diplomatic procedures of declaring war, and get the German parliament together so that he can give them the good news of war with the United States. But the idea that this is going to take 2, 3, 4, perish forbid, 5 days is absolutely beyond Hitler's willingness to operate slowly. Under the circumstances, he makes a very interesting decision. He had, until this time, restrained the commander of the German Navy, Admiral Raeder, who had been wanting to start war with the United States since October of 1939. As soon as he hears of the attack on Pearl Harbor, he sends orders to the German Navy High Command to start sinking the ships of the United States and 8 other countries in the Western Hemisphere that are likely to join it. On the 11th, by the 11th, he does get to Berlin. He gives the speech, tells the German parliament the good news of war with the United States, and goes through the diplomatic procedure with the American chargé d'affaires in Berlin. And on the same day, Mussolini does the same thing in Rome. And just as Roosevelt on 8th December has called on the Congress to declare war on Japan, which has just attacked the United States. So after Germany and Italy on the 11th of December declare war on the United States, Roosevelt, knowing they have submarines in the Atlantic that will sink American ships, orders the, not orders, suggests to the American Congress that we should declare war on Germany and Italy. And the Congress does so. What tends to be forgotten is that in December 41, not only does Japan attack the United States and Germany and Italy declare war on the United States, 3 other European countries, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, declare war on the United States. But when that happens, Roosevelt does not go to the Congress and suggest, well, we're at war. Instead, in a measure for which I know no precedent, he instructs the State Department to try through diplomatic contacts to get those 3 countries to withdraw their declarations of war and remain at peace with the United States. What do we want to fight Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria for? And besides, what especially are the Hungarians going to do to us? At the time, December 41, Turkey is still neutral. So in Ankara, the capital of Turkey, American diplomats get in touch with the diplomats there from Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and suggest to them that the American people, the American government, would like them to give serious thought to withdrawing, rescinding their declarations of war on the United States. Why do they have to have a war with the United States? The negotiations, as I said, and contacts go through the neutral capital of Turkey, where all sides have diplomats. But the Regent Admiral Horthy of Hungary, Marshal Antonescu of Romania, and King Boris of Bulgaria are all absolutely certain that they and their people cannot be happy unless they have war with the United States. In the summer of 42, Roosevelt gives up. And on the 18th of June, sends a message to the Congress of the United States telling them a little bit about the background here and suggesting that there is no realistic alternative to the Congress passing a resolution that there is a state of war between the United States and those 3 countries. And that is, of course, what the Congress then does. Note that under the circumstances of the time, the United States is now at war with both Germany and Italy in Europe and their satellites, and is also at war with Japan. This possibility had been thought about by both the President and our top military leaders as to if and when that does happen, what do we do? And which of these parts of the global conflict should have priority? And the American government leaders were in general agreement that if this happened, the threat across both the Atlantic and the Pacific, we would have to cope with Germany first. And there were basically, in their thinking, two reasons for this decision, which would affect the allocation of forces and reinforcements thereafter. One basis for the decision, was that Germany was seen as the more dangerous to the United States. Not just because they were closer geographically, but because it was at least the judgment in the top American circles that their military was superior to that of Japan, and therefore more dangerous. We knew that they didn't have an intercontinental bomber, and they didn't have that much of a navy, but they had a very effective army, and who knew what they might do next. They were, in effect, thought of as the more dangerous. The other reason why we would do this was that we knew that the two countries that would be our main allies in the war, that is to say, Britain and the Soviet Union against Germany and Britain against Japan, had no choice. The British had the Germans across the English Channel 20 miles away, were bombing them, had been bombing them, might invade them at any time, and the Soviets had them in their front room. That is to say, they had invaded the country, and that whether or not Japan attacked the Soviet Union, which apparently it wasn't going to, certainly the Soviets were concentrating on Germany. So that if we did not join Britain and France in defeating Germany first, but instead concentrated on Japan first, the whole thing would be much longer and more difficult. And in retrospect, that was undoubtedly a sensible judgment, but it was one that people tend to forget our leaders had made before we were drawn into the war. And while there were arguments during the period from 41 to 45 over this, over the allocations, basically speaking, the United States stuck to this. The only way in which it was somewhat modified was in the earlier stages we allocated more to the Pacific than we had intended because of the very extensive Japanese original advance. They went further, faster than we had imagined they would and could. And since in practice they could and did, that affected our allocations and meant we had to do more in the Pacific in 42 and 43 than we had originally thought we would have to. And that, however, we never allowed to interfere with the basic concept of a priority for the defeat of Germany and Italy in Europe. And so the United States is pulled into the war against its preference and against its hopes. But once it's in, there is the other side, which in a way the Japanese had reinforced. There won't be any negotiations and armistice this time. Back in 1918, there had been some who had argued that the First World War should not end in an armistice with Germany. And Franklin Roosevelt was one of them. But he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and as a loyal member of the Wilson administration, he went along with that. But in the Second World War, he's not an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's the President of the United States, who has just been elected to an unprecedented third term. And it is his judgment from day one that this time both the Japanese and the Germans are going to have to surrender unconditionally. There will not be a negotiated armistice as there had been in 1918 and as there would be with Korea in '53 or earlier after the Spanish-American War there had been with Spain. This time there would be only an unconditional surrender, and the Japanese decision to substitute the Pearl Harbor Plan for a major naval engagement not only reinforced Roosevelt's view of this, but brought that perspective the support of the bulk of the American public. I was a teenager at the time and recall the long fighting on Guadalcanal and Okinawa and so on. And one never heard people in this country advocating a settlement with Japan. And one heard of our setback in Tunisia in the winter of '42-'43, and the bitter fighting up the Italian peninsula. But one never heard people suggesting that we make a deal with the Germans. The concept that this time around we would fight till the others surrendered was there, and as I mentioned earlier, the way the Japanese started the war with the United States reinforced this perspective to the American, or the bulk of the American public. That's the way we'd fight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gerhard. And we're going to move into some questions now. I want to remind everyone that you can use the question and answer function on the Zoom in order to pose a question. I wanted to ask just one question. First of all,
Louder.
Do you think the United States would have declared war on Germany if Hitler had not taken that step first? Would the United States have entered the war against Germany in 1941 or 42?
No, we would not have, but the Germans would not have entered the war against us except under the circumstances where Japan had already gone to war with us. That is to say, and the Japanese would not have gone to war with us unless they were certain. A few days before their attack on Pearl Harbor, 2nd or 3rd of December, the Japanese, who knew that Hitler and Mussolini didn't always keep their word, checked with the Germans and the Japanese. Are you really in it with us if we go? And the answer was yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And if the Germans and the Italians had not promised the Japanese to go to war with us, the Japanese wouldn't have gone to war with us. So the issue of only the Japanese going to war with us was never a real one. They were not going to war with us by themselves. That was why they had told the Germans that they would conquer Southeast Asia in 1946. And the Germans understood that that was the year when the Americans were pulling out of their bases in the Philippines.
Okay, thank you very much. We have some questions coming in here. The first from our friend Jonathan Gerard. He's interested in the broader question of how the war came about and behind Hitler's ideology. Would you say that the most important driver of World War II was the ideology of Nazism or economic drives to expand German economic influence?
Well, there is no separation between the two. That is to say, the Nazi ideology was for Germany needed and should get more living space. And the only way that you could get the living space added to Germany was by war. That is to say, it wasn't a matter of some Germans leaving Germany and settling either in the West or in the East and raising food. It was the expansion of the country, and that was not possible without war. And the Germans themselves, knew it from the beginning. That is, if you were going to expand your living space, not by emigrating, but by taking the land, you would have to fight for it. And that's what they were going to do.
So from the very beginning, the appeal of the Nazis combined both the ideology and the economic interest in expansion.
Well, that was a part of the ideology.
Yeah.
That you needed the land to settle on instead of having people leave Germany and settle and become citizens of Canada, of the United States, of Argentina, of any place they move to.
Okay, here's another question from James Evans having to do with our attitude toward Japan. Do you think that our disregard of Japan and their threat during the 1930s made war inevitable? Or should we have been more engaged with Japan during the 1930s? Would that have made a difference?
Well, we were certainly, after 37, not very friendly towards the Japanese. I'm not sure that anything much we could have done. What is so interesting is that in 41, in the negotiations, the key issue was southern French Indochina. The Japanese had managed to live for several millennia without controlling southern French Indochina. But they needed the southern part of French Indochina to attack Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States. And the U.S. offered to sell them all the oil they could possibly want if they would get out of that. And the Japanese decided not to. As I said, if they'd waited a couple more weeks, it's conceivable that they might have. But the initiative in this key issue was exclusively with the Japanese. And our government was trying to hold and stall them until they could see that they were operating on an error, the assumption that Germany was guaranteed to win the war. And by the time they struck, it was quite clear that Germany was not guaranteed to win the war. But they miscalculated.
Do you think that this questioner also asked, was racism a factor in our
I'm sorry,
attitude?
I cannot hear.
Was racism a factor in our policies toward either Japan or Germany? That is to say, did we take the Japanese differently because of the racial difference that was perceived?
No, I don't think so. The Americans had contributed very heavily in the 1920s to the relief after the great Kanto earthquake in Japan. Opinion turned as the Japanese behaved atrociously in China. And for the ordinary American, there wasn't any racial difference between Chinese and Japanese. These were just very nasty people who did very nasty things to other Orientals and to whites both. It was the Japanese. And after all, we were helping, not a lot, but some, the other Oriental people, that is the Chinese. And from the perspective of the ordinary American, there was no racial difference between Chinese and Japanese. It's they were in different countries that were behaving fundamentally differently. And we were helping the Chinese against the Japanese.
Okay, I want to move to another question. We have a question here from Rita Jankovic, who says, what was Hitler's greatest strategic mistake? If that mistake could have been reversed, how close would Germany have come to winning the war in Europe? What was the key strategic error that Hitler made in that war?
I am not at all sure that he made any major strategic error. They were not going to get what he was after without invading the Soviet Union. And they were unable to crush Britain. So that under the circumstances, Germany was again in a multi-front war instead of on a single-front war as it had. Keep in mind, in 1864, they fought Denmark, the German states, and won. In 66, Prussia fought the other German states and won. In 70-71, they fought the French and won. Each of those was essentially a one-front war. The First World War was not a one-front war. They fought both in the East and in the West and lost. In the Second World War, the longer they waited, the stronger the Soviet Union and Britain would become. There wasn't any real way to attain what they were after without trying a multi-front war again. And the Germans did not have either the people or the resources to win a multi-front war. You have only to consider what would have happened if the Japanese had not brought the U.S. into the war. The Soviet Union and Britain would eventually have defeated Germany. The big difference would have been that the Soviets would have occupied more of Europe in the process. But it was clear that Germany could not win a multi-front war.
So The strategic error was the ideology itself that assumed you had to invade the Soviet Union.
Yes,
and
the
therefore you have
ideology called for something that for a country in the middle of Europe was unattainable.
unattainable. Yeah.
It was always possible for some Germans as individuals to go settle elsewhere. But the notion of acquiring additional land after 1900 or after 1871 was just not going to work.
So here's another question. This comes from Doug Anderson. And the question has to do with naval strategy during the Second World War. And your reference to war number 4 that Hitler had envisioned, the invasion of the United States.
Yeah.
He asks, given the way in which aircraft carriers had become so important by the 1940s, wasn't this strategy of simply building super-sized battleships doomed from the beginning? In other words, why was Hitler not building aircraft carriers in the 1940s?
They were starting to build aircraft carriers. They had gotten a good long way with one of them, the Graf Zeppelin. And in fact, I've always thought that was a cute, humorous aspect to this. At one point after the Battle of Midway, and this is how the Germans discovered that the Japanese had lost, not won the Battle of Midway, the Japanese wanted to buy the Graf Zeppelin, the unfinished aircraft carrier, and tow it to the Pacific. And the Americans who intercepted and decoded the relevant documents, dispatches between Berlin and Tokyo, thought that would be a wonderful opportunity to torpedo this thing when it's being towed through the South Atlantic and across the Indian Ocean to Japan. But the Germans decided not to agree to this. And I am sure that the American intelligence people who were reading this were very disappointed that we did not have the opportunity that would arise when this thing was towed from Germany to Japan. The Germans were also hoping and planning additional aircraft carriers, but it was all much too late, and the war was already on. It was the same thing as they started the battleships, laid down the keels for the first 2 in February '39, but never finished them. The Japanese, as you know, started 4, scrapped 1, turned 1 into an aircraft carrier, the Shinano, which was sunk by an American submarine, and finished 2, the biggest battleships ever built, the Musashi, destroyed in the naval fighting in the Philippines, near the Philippines, in the fall of '44, and the Yamato destroyed when it tried to help the Japanese in the fight for Okinawa in the spring of '45. That wasn't going to do it.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question from Jonathan Gerard. If Germany had such an obsession about more land, why did this same ideology, the desire for more land, not develop in the same way in Great Britain or France or Belgium or Greece or the Netherlands? Why only Germany had this obsession developed?
Well, because it was put to them in a way that they found interesting and worthwhile. That the idea of being racially superior to others was very appealing. It tends to be appealing to people. It's nice to be told you're better and superior to others. And they knew that lots of Germans had emigrated, had gone to other countries to live. And now that they had since 1871 only, they were a new country, that they now finally had their own country, maybe instead of Germans having to go elsewhere for space, maybe we can conquer and add some. Now, there were people in other European countries who thought in somewhat similar ways, but they never really took over a country. And even in Italy, while Mussolini had massive public support, and there was support for colonialism, there was not the same kind of expansionist ideology in Germany. And in fact, a good case can be made that Mussolini's decision to support Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union by allocating very substantial forces to the Eastern Front, where then, especially in 1942, they suffered very heavy casualties, helped to destroy the public support for the fascist regime in Italy, because the Italian people, many said, what on earth are we doing over there? I mean, what's the point of this? It's one thing to expand our colonial empire in Africa, but the Russians have been our friends. What are we fighting them for? The notion of the kind of expansion the Germans were talking about at the time we're reviewing, others didn't have.
So I wondered if I could ask a final question. When we look at these three important moments during the Second World War in 1941, the North African campaign, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which of these three moments in 1941 do you think had the greatest impact on the ultimate outcome of the war?
I'm not sure that one of them had a greater impact than the other. They combined, in a way, to determine the victory of the Allies, the sequence in which it was most likely to occur, and with the Africa thing that Italy would lose first, and with the allocation decisions that Germany would lose next, and that Japan would lose last.
So it's very interesting. If Hitler had not taken each of those steps, the war might have come out differently. But they were all part of the ideology that
Yes,
Hitler
because
had, the expansion.
he was absolutely clear there had to be war.
Yeah.
War was not started as the necessary defense. Nobody was about to attack Germany. Nobody was about to do anything to the Germans. And so, as I said, he was very upset. His one mistake, biggest mistake, was not going to war in 1938. And no one was going to cheat him of war in 1939. And in fact, in his last conference with the top military leaders of Germany before the attack on Poland in late August of 1939, he said, I mean, the only thing I'm worried about is that at the last moment some Saukerl, I guess we'd say SOB, will come along with a way to avoid the war. And since he was very concerned always about home front morale, he wanted to make sure that the German public was united for the war that he was going to start.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Gerhard. I think we're coming now to the end of our seminar. This is our first ever Adventures and Ideas Zoom webinar, and I can't think of a better person to launch this historic transition in the history of CPH. Thank all of you for being with us. It has been a great pleasure to see many of our old friends again. We hope we'll see you starting this Wednesday, September the 16th, at our next event, and then in the coming week, the program on the allure and attraction of dictators. And I want to thank again Gerhard Weinberg for making the effort to come to Flyleaf Books and to lead us through this very complicated history of 1941. Thank you, and I wish you all the best, Gerhard, and I wish everybody out there in Zoom land a good weekend. We'll see you again soon. And keep up the conversation. The humanities are more important than ever. All the best.